They called it election security. It wasn't. In a single afternoon, Speaker Mike Johnson took one of Donald Trump's most divisive election bills, strapped it to military funding, troop pay, and a ban on congressional stock trading, and then dared Democrats to vote against it. That is not bipartisan compromise. That is not honest legislating. That is political hostage-taking, carefully designed so that anyone who objects can be smeared as anti-military, anti-security, or somehow opposed to American citizens voting. And now, Trump's allies are celebrating because 6 House Democrats voted for the massive defense package containing these election provisions. They are calling it a collapse. They are calling it a historic breakthrough. They are claiming the Democratic wall has finally cracked. The actual numbers tell a very different story. The National Defense Authorization Act passed the House 216 to 212. 6 Democrats voted yes. 205 Democrats voted no. 7 Republicans also rejected the package. 6 Democratic votes inside a massive defense bill do not prove that Democrats suddenly embraced Trump's election agenda. They prove that Mike Johnson successfully buried a controversial election measure inside legislation dealing with the United States military. That distinction changes everything. Trump and Johnson want Americans to believe Congress faced one simple question. Should voters prove they are citizens and show identification? That is the slogan. The actual legislation is far more complicated. Federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections. People who knowingly violate that law can be investigated, prosecuted, and convicted. The Justice Department has continued bringing such cases. The real dispute is not whether non-citizens should vote. They cannot legally vote in federal elections now. The real dispute concerns how much documentation eligible American citizens should be forced to produce, which documents will be accepted, how voters correct paperwork problems, and how these requirements could affect people who do not have easy access to passports, matching birth certificates, or other government records. Instead of debating those questions honestly, Republicans reduced the entire issue to a campaign slogan: show an ID or admit you support illegal voting. That is a false choice. A person can support secure elections while also opposing unnecessary barriers that could prevent lawful citizens from registering or having their ballots counted. Election officials and voting access advocates have warned that documentary requirements can especially burden older voters, rural residents, naturalized citizens, low-income Americans, and people whose current names do not match older citizenship records. Those concerns deserve a real debate. Mike Johnson chose a trap instead. For months, Trump's election bill struggled to advance through the Senate. It could not attract enough support to overcome the filibuster. It faced procedural problems under reconciliation rules. Even some Republicans resisted parts of the legislation. That should have forced the party to negotiate. Trump chose pressure. He elevated the Save America Act into a loyalty test and reportedly threatened to freeze the rest of his legislative agenda until Congress delivered stricter voting restrictions. Think about that. The president was prepared to hold unrelated legislation hostage because Congress would not immediately give him the election rules he demanded. Mike Johnson then carried that same tactic into the House. Unable to move the policy through a clean and transparent process, Johnson divided the operation into multiple legislative vehicles. One route involved budget reconciliation. Another involved the annual Defense Authorization Bill. A third involved legislation marketed as a ban on congressional stock trading. 3 separate vehicles, 3 separate attempts to conceal election policy inside something politically painful to oppose. Trump's allies call that strategic genius. A more honest description is legislative camouflage. The House narrowly approved a fiscal year 2027 budget resolution by a vote of 216 to 214. No Democrats supported it, while 2 Republicans joined the opposition. The plan described in the original script includes billions of dollars in new spending, with approximately $10 billion intended to encourage states to adopt elements of Trump's election agenda. Republicans had previously encountered a major procedural problem. direct federal election mandates might not qualify for the fast-track reconciliation process. Their solution was not to abandon the policy. Their solution was to disguise it as spending. Instead of directly ordering states to change their election laws, Washington could offer enormous financial incentives to states that comply. That may sound voluntary on paper. In reality, billions of dollars in federal funding can create overwhelming pressure, especially for states and local election systems already struggling with limited resources. This is not simply an election security program. It is an attempt to use federal money to reshape state election systems without obtaining the broader Senate support that direct legislation would normally require. Republicans are trying to purchase through reconciliation what they could not win through persuasion. The most cynical move came next. Johnson attached the full election package to the National Defense Authorization Act, the annual legislation governing military programs, defense policy, weapons procurement, and compensation for service members. Now, every senator who objects to Trump's election provisions can be accused of voting against the military. That accusation is already built into the strategy. Trump's allies are practically writing the campaign advertisements in advance. Democrats voted against American troops because they didn't want voter ID. That line may be politically powerful. It is also deeply dishonest. Members of Congress regularly vote against large packages containing provisions they support because those same packages also contain provisions they oppose. A vote against a defense bill containing election restrictions does not automatically mean opposition to troop pay. Just as a vote for the bill does not automatically mean support for every election provision hidden inside it. 6 Democrats supported the NDAA package. 205 Democrats opposed it. 7 Republicans voted no as well. Those Republican defections immediately exposed the weakness in Johnson's argument. Are those 7 Republicans against the troops? Are they against American security? Are they secretly supporting illegal voting? Of course not. They may have objected to spending, military policy, the election provisions, or the process itself. Democrats are entitled to the same distinction. Johnson does not want voters thinking about legislative complexity. He wants one emotionally loaded image: Democrats standing between soldiers and their paychecks. Military families are being turned into political shields for Trump's election agenda. That should offend every American, regardless of party. The original narrative treats 6 Democratic votes as though an entire party surrendered. Look at the arithmetic. 6 Democrats voted yes. 205 voted no. That is not a collapsing wall. That is an overwhelmingly unified opposition with a small number of defections inside an enormous defense package. Several of the 6 Democrats represent politically competitive districts. Their votes may have reflected concerns about national defense, local military interests, electoral pressure, or dozens of other provisions contained in the bill. Trump's supporters simply declared that all 6 had endorsed the Save America Act. No evidence was offered that the election language was the decisive reason for every vote. This is how political propaganda works. Take a complicated vote, erase the context, assign lawmakers a convenient motive, then announce that the opposition is falling apart. The vote was technically bipartisan because members of both parties supported the final package. Technically, bipartisan does not mean broadly bipartisan. 6 Democratic votes do not transform a deeply divided party line battle into a national consensus. Johnson's team was still not finished. House Republicans also combined voter identification requirements with the Stop Insider Trading Act. A congressional stock trading ban is enormously popular because Americans across the political spectrum are tired of lawmakers potentially benefiting from financial information unavailable to the public. That legislation should have received its own clean vote. Instead, House leaders inserted election requirements into the package. The House bill text requires photo identification for in-person federal voting and creates additional requirements for ballots cast outside polling places. Depending on the circumstances, voters may have to provide an identification copy, Social Security information with an affidavit, or notarization. Tai le quoc hoi for. Those provisions have nothing to do with members of Congress trading stocks. Nothing. The two subjects were combined for political leverage, not policy coherence. Johnson knew Democrats would face a damaging choice: accept Trump's voting provisions or vote against legislation advertised as stopping congressional corruption. Once again, this was not persuasion, it was packaging. Trump's allies repeatedly described the proposal as nothing more than showing identification. The bill text reveals a much larger administrative system. In-person voters without qualifying identification could be pushed into provisional ballot procedures and required to present documentation within a limited period. People voting outside a polling place may face additional verification requirements. States would need to modify registration systems, ballot procedures, databases, training programs, voter notifications, and document handling practices. The burden would not fall on imaginary voters. It would fall on real American citizens navigating a more complicated system. A married voter whose current surname differs from the name on an old birth certificate may face questions. A rural citizen living far from a government office may face logistical obstacles. An elderly voter who no longer drives may not possess the documents Trump's supporters assume everyone carries. A lawful citizen should not lose access to the ballot because political operatives designed election rules around the lives of people with passports, flexible work schedules, reliable transportation, and perfectly matching records. Secure elections and accessible elections are not opposites. A competent government should provide both. Trump says the legislation will restore confidence in elections. His political movement has spent years attacking that confidence. Every defeat becomes suspicious. Every unfavorable result becomes evidence of corruption. Every ordinary administrative mistake becomes part of a national conspiracy. Now the same politicians who weakened public trust are presenting themselves as the only people capable of restoring it. Their solution is always the same: more control, more restrictions. More power concentrated in the hands of officials loyal to Trump's view of elections. The Save America Act is being sold as a response to a crisis. The legislation supporters have not demonstrated a level of non-citizen federal voting remotely large enough to justify treating millions of eligible citizens as potential fraudsters. Even the existence of isolated illegal cases does not prove that the entire national registration system requires a sweeping overhaul. Crimes should be prosecuted. Eligible voters should not be collectively punished. Mike Johnson may have created an ugly political dilemma, but the Senate is not required to accept his manufactured choice. Senators can remove the election provisions. They can amend the defense package. They can demand separate votes. They can refuse to let military funding become a vehicle for partisan election policy. The same principle applies to the stock trading bill. Congress should vote on congressional ethics as congressional ethics. It should vote on defense as defense. It should debate election law openly, with hearings, testimony, implementation analysis, and enough time for the public to understand the consequences. Trump and Johnson do not want that process. A clean debate would expose the real questions their slogans are designed to hide. How many eligible citizens could be affected? How much would implementation cost? Which documents would be accepted? How would states handle mismatched records? How would voters correct mistakes? Why should national defense and military compensation be threatened over an unrelated election dispute? Those questions are inconvenient, so Johnson replaced them with a trap. The real story is not that 6 Democrats suddenly embraced Trump's election agenda. The real story is that Republican leaders could not advance their policy through an honest standalone process, so they buried it inside 3 politically sensitive packages. They used federal grants to work around procedural restrictions. They used military pay and defense policy to silence opposition. They used a popular congressional stock trading ban as cover for new voting requirements. Then they called the result bipartisan because 6 Democrats supported one enormous package containing hundreds of other priorities. That is not a mandate. That is manipulation. No voter should be fooled by the slogan election integrity when the legislative process itself is this deliberately misleading. A party confident in its policy would place that policy on the floor by itself. It would defend every provision. It would answer criticism. It would accept amendments. It would win support through evidence. Trump and Johnson chose a different route because the political weapon mattered more than the democratic process. The question facing the Senate is not whether lawmakers support American troops. It is not whether they support secure elections. The real question is whether Congress will allow Donald Trump and Mike Johnson to turn soldiers, military families, federal funding, and ethics reform into bargaining chips for a partisan election agenda. Voting rights should never be hidden inside a defense bill. Military pay should never be held hostage to election restrictions. A ban on congressional stock trading should never become camouflage for an unrelated political demand. Americans deserve clean bills, honest debates, and election laws designed to protect eligible voters, not campaign traps designed to protect Donald Trump. Mike Johnson did not break through a Democratic wall. He avoided a Democratic debate. And now the Senate must decide whether it will reward that deception or finally expose it. If you believe Congress should stop hiding controversial policies inside must-pass legislation, share this video and tell us what you think below. Is this election security? Or is it one of the most cynical legislative power grabs Washington has attempted in years?